All right, so the next thing that we need to do is take this empty GitHub repo that's in the cloud, it's not connected at all to our local repo, and somehow configure our local repo so that it knows about this GitHub repo. Well, the way that we do this, whether we're using GitHub or any other service that hosts a repo, is to set up a Git remote. So a remote is really just a fancy name for like a destination URL. It's a URL that we tell Git about, and we give it a name. It's just like a label for a URL that we can then push code up to, or fetch or pull down new code from. So we'll learn about those commands once we set up a remote. So an easy place to start is with this command, git remote or git remote -v. They won't do anything except list to you the current remotes that you have in a repository. So in our repository, we have not configured any remotes, right? At this point, we haven't done anything with remotes. If I type git remote or git remote -v, I'm in my book, my first novel, The Great Gatsby repo, nothing. But if we actually go to any of the repos that we cloned, if you followed along, I cloned this 2048 repo from GitHub. Remember this one? It has a whole bunch of commits. It's that addicting 2048 game. Anyway, if I type git remote in here, I see something now. Origin. We'll talk about that in a moment. Let's do -v so you can see the difference. If I do -v, I think it's verbose, we see the name of a remote and the corresponding URL. So I didn't set this up, right? All I did was git clone and then this URL. And by doing that, Git made me a local repo. It put all these files in here. It gave me all the history. And it set up a remote that said the original GitHub URL that this repo came from, that it was cloned from, is right here. So by setting this URL up, this remote origin, it gives me the ability later on to say, hey, Git, is there any new code on that URL? Is there any new updates? Or if I was a collaborator, hey, Git, I'd like to push up my new 10 commits. It's kind of a lot to push up, but I'd like to push my new 2 commits that I did today up to origin. Okay, so I'll just show you one more example. If I take a look at, let's see, sample project, that was the one that I cloned in the second video I did. It's really very simple, nothing in it. It came from, was it Bitbucket, I believe? If I do git remote -v, no, GitLab, sorry. It was a non-GitHub repository. The same thing is true, right? I have a remote called origin automatically set up. I didn't do that. And it's set to whatever I cloned, or whatever the URL is that I cloned it from. Okay, so we did not clone this repository, right? My first novel, we ran git init. We created it from scratch. So there are no remotes. But we can make a remote using this command, git remote add, and then a name and a URL. So this is a way of telling Git, hello Git, please remember this URL using this name. So whatever the name is that we provide. So a really standard name is origin. So git remote add origin and then some GitHub URL for a GitHub repo that we've created is telling Git, hey, here's a URL. I'm going to call it origin. You remember that. Anytime I refer to origin, I'm talking about this URL. So the term origin, it's just a conventional Git remote name, but it's not special in any way, no magical powers. It doesn't have any secret abilities. It's just a name for a URL. You could rename them. You can come up with whatever names you want for remotes, but origin is what you'll see all the time. Similar to how the master branch is a default name, or the default name for branches, you can change it to anything. So in the same way that master is just a name for a branch, origin is just a conventional name. You'll see it a lot, but it is not somehow special. It's just a name for a remote. So we could instead add a new remote for the same URL, but instead call it my GitHub URL, or LOL, or chickens are my friends, whatever you want. But I would suggest origin because it's what you'll see the most, and then a URL. And actually, if we go to the GitHub repository that we created that's empty, we see some instructions. It's telling us, first of all, if you've done this thing before, this kind of thing before, here's a URL. That is the URL for my repo. I hope this goes without saying. You should be using your URL, right? Not my repo, because you won't have permission to push your code up to my repository. So I hope you made your own if you're following along. Then it's telling me, if you don't have a repo yet on at all locally, follow these instructions. But I do. So I'm not following those. This is what we want. Push an existing repo from the command line. And take a look at the very first line. Git remote, add origin, and then the URL for my Git repo. It's the same URL we see here. So I'm going to copy that, or just copy the whole line. It doesn't really matter. I guess I'll separate it out just to hit the point harder here. So I'm on the My First Novel repository. Right now, no remotes. Now, Git remote, add, and then a name. I'm going to go with origin. It's conventional. And then this GitHub URL, whatever your GitHub URL is for that repo. Now, nothing really happens, but of course we can check our work with what we just saw, git remote-v. So hopefully we see origin set up to this URL, and it is. So that's kind of all we need to do for now. We've connected, we've told our local Git repo about a GitHub URL called origin, or that's the name that we'll refer to it by. So in the next video, I'll show you how we can push code up to origin. I just want to emphasize one more time, it's just a name for a URL, a remote destination. And this is not super common, but if needed, you can rename a remote with this command, git remote rename the old name space new name. And you can get rid of a remote with git remote remove and then the name that you're trying to delete. And later on, we'll actually see that it's somewhat common to have multiple remotes, especially when you're working on open source projects. We'll talk about workflows and how that would work when we get to that section. Okay,